Modern.
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 We're prepping for a voyage.
Modern.
The force of an old-fashioned equals whiskey mass times bitters acceleration.
Why don't you make that a double?
Modern bar cart.
What's shaking, cocktail fans? Happy New Year and welcome to episode 294 of the Modern Bar Cart podcast. I'm your host, Eric Kozlik. Thanks for tuning in to part 2 of this multi-episode exploration of artificial intelligence and its impact on the cocktail world, where I'm joined by Rob Nestor, creator of the hit podcast Drinking with Robots. If you haven't checked out part 1 just yet, you might want to do that. It's the episode right before this one, where we cover Rob's origin story plus some key insights about AI that he gleaned from the first season of his show. So if you need to go back and listen, I'll wait right here. But if you're already caught up, let's go ahead and reward you with a drink. In honor of the new year, 2025, this episode's featured cocktail is the Quarter Century Cocktail. Created by YouTube cocktail influencer Anders Ericsson with some random ingredients he had on hand, it represents an unusual confluence of flavors that work together much better than one might initially expect. To make the Quarter Century Cocktail, you'll need 1/2 ounce Campari, 1/2 ounce apricot liqueur, the one that Anders used was from Giffard, 1 dash of absinthe, which is something like 1/8 to 1/16 of an ounce, just a little dribble on a bar spoon if you don't have a dasher bottle, and finally 4 ounces of dry sparkling wine. Combine the Campari, apricot liqueur, and absinthe in a cocktail mixing glass with a small to moderate amount of ice. Remember, this is only going to be a little bit more than an ounce of liquid combined. Stir just long enough to dilute and chill the ingredients, then strain into a chilled stemmed cocktail glass, top with that nice pour of sparkling wine, garnish with an expressed and discarded lemon twist, and enjoy. If you squint, this cocktail's floating somewhere in between a Corpse Reviver No. 2, an Aperol Spritz, and a Death in the Afternoon, with all the disparate flavors kind of pulled together by the assertive force of the sparkling wine. It's refreshing and effervescent enough to serve as a toast to a new quarter century, but flavorful enough to give you something to contemplate for the rest of the year. According to Anders, this is going to be a new modern classic cocktail, which I think is an interesting opinion to have about a drink that you just invented, but hey, I guess only time will tell. So now that you've got a celebratory sipper in hand, let's jump straight into part 2 of this AI cocktails investigation. Appropriately for dry January, we left our last episode on a bit of a sobering statistic, which is that in a live, professionally judged cocktail competition put on by Drinking with Robots, ChatGPT knocked out 5 of 7 human bartenders in the very first round. That's a 70% success rate, and a really compelling reason why we should take seriously the notion of a short-term future where AI is deployed more frequently and more effectively behind the bar. And as a way of imagining ourselves into that sort of a future, I'd like to kick off this episode with a little thought experiment. See, one of my big issues with the discourse around AI is that it usually boils down to friend or foe. Artificial intelligence is either gonna kill us all in some Matrix or Terminator style future where the singularity occurs and computers set out to annihilate humanity, or it's going to do all our busy work and chores for us, leaving us free to do yoga and learn how to paint. As with most things, the reality will almost certainly lie somewhere between these two extremes, and I think that messy middle ground is worth exploring. As I record this, I'm 35 years old. Thinking back 30 years, cell phones were a nascent technology. They were big and ugly and only really passable at executing the single task they were designed for, making phone calls. 12 years later, as I graduated high school, the first iPhone launched. And now, 18 years after that, we're walking around with supercomputers in our pockets. So here's the thought experiment. Assuming that right now we're dealing with a version of AI that's comparable to the big clunky cell phones of the 90s, imagine that AI will undergo a similarly drastic series of upgrades and transformations and ask yourself this question. In 30 years, what tasks and responsibilities will I be willing to outsource to AI? Think about it. A lot of you listening are already outsourcing a portion of your writing and email correspondence to large language models like ChatGPT. People everywhere are using it as a search engine, right? Effectively replacing Google. And software engineers are even using it to generate original computer code in pretty much any language they need. This is the clunky 90s cell phone phase. So go ahead and give yourself permission to dream big about what AI will be able to do in 30 years' time. I assume most of us will be pretty quick to outsource rote or monotonous or clerical tasks in the digital realm. Personally, I'm sure I'd be comfortable delegating most of my admin, from accounting to insurance to taxes and bill pay, all to artificial intelligence. Is it a little risky? It seems a little risky, sure, but so was online banking a decade or two ago, and now we're all doing it like it's nothing. I assume most of us would also feel pretty comfortable using AI to optimize our homes, right? Adjusting thermostats, watering plants, changing the mood lighting, telling us when it's time to order more seltzer, maybe feeding the dog. The so-called Internet of Things, which contains everything from smart fridges to home security to doggy cams, is really booming right now. So all those things that we called chores in the 90s and which we currently manage by tapping on our smartphones should easily be on the road to AI delegation in the next couple decades, right? Why check your doorbell camera or adjust the thermostat from your phone when you can just let your AI assistant handle all of that for you? Seems reasonable to me. But what about driving? I mean, when I drove to college for the first time, I used a dial-up internet connection. Listen, I lived in the woods. We had to put up with that dial-up connection for a little longer than the rest of you townies, right? So I used a dial-up internet connection to print out 4 pages of MapQuest directions with turn-by-turn instructions for how to get across 4 states so that I was in time for orientation. Now, these days, we're all using Waze and Google Maps to sniff out speed traps and reroute us around traffic, and it seems like every major tech company is piloting self-driving technology. But, I mean, we've all heard the news stories where those self-driving vehicles cause terrible accidents, right? Loss of life and limb. And personally, I don't know about you, but I love driving. And not to brag, but I'm an awesome driver. I like how the vehicle becomes an extension of my body. I love the feeling of being in motion. And I even enjoy, within reason, the challenge of reading the flow of traffic to predict what other drivers will do as I navigate my way through the world. Currently, I outsource 2 components of my driving, the navigation and the speed regulation. I use cruise control regularly on the highway to make sure that I don't get a ticket, but with the push of a button or the tap of a brake pedal, I'm back in control. And there are plenty of occasions when I look at Waze, when it tries to get me to take a certain route, and think, no thanks, I know a better way. So even in a world where self-driving technology seems imminent, I don't think I can ever really bring myself to outsource my driving to AI. That's going to be a really tough sell for me, and even if it has to happen, I'm going to be unhappy about it. And I have the feeling that if you think long and hard enough, there'll probably be some aspect of your life that you feel similarly about. I bring up this thought experiment because these lines that we are willing or unwilling to cross when it comes to tasks we assign to artificial intelligence are part of a larger trend called outsourcing cognition. That is, taking something that used to require our brains and bodies and entrusting that job to a program or a device. As an example, when was the last time you opened the weather app on your phone to see what the weather and temperature were like outside instead of just opening a door or a window to see how it actually looks and feels? I do this all the time, and I do it without thinking too hard about it. But walk through the differences, if you will, between those 2 processes. On one hand, a finger tap to open an app, you probably have to navigate to a different view, maybe the hourly or the radar view, to get the information you want. And if you're like me, you're too practical to use the paid version of the weather app. So then you get served a Verizon ad that takes 5 seconds before you can close it, and finally you arrive at a screen that gives you a couple of numerical and iconographic metaphors for the weather. A temperature number and maybe a picture of a sun peeking out from behind a cloud or some rain falling. In the other instance, you take a couple of steps, turn a doorknob, or open a window, and you're instantly greeted by a tangible, embodied encounter with the real conditions you were curious about. There's no digital intermediary, no metaphor making. Your body and brain become the instruments that do the measuring and the evaluation. Now, maybe in both these cases, the outcome is the same. It's nice and sunny, but that breeze is a little cool, so hey, I'll bring a sweater with me today. But the fact of the matter is, in one scenario, you outsourced your cognition, and in the other, you didn't. And before you think that this is an entirely modern phenomenon, one of the best and earliest examples of outsourced cognition was the invention of the book. Instead of walking around with the Odyssey or Beowulf in the heads of certain bards, stories got written down. Boom. Memory outsourced. So now that we've made it through our little technological thought experiment, let me ask you this. Whether you're actively creating cocktails or simply enjoying them as a guest at your favorite bar, what components of that experience are you willing to outsource, and at what point does that outsourcing begin to tarnish the aspects of a great cocktail experience that you fell in love with in the first place? I pose this question because, according to Rob, we're likely to see a lot more bars start using AI for cocktail development and menu creation in the near future. Take a listen. Do you think that since you've demonstrated that AI can be so powerful and so, I guess, versatile in certain respects with creating these cocktail specs, do you see any use cases or maybe even just a far off vision of a world where we're going to have AI and bartenders working hand in hand and have that not be weird?
You know, it would be interesting. The qualifications I would have to put on this is that the AI would have to know what you had in stock so that it's not speccing things that there's no way you can produce in the time that you're going to have to pour that cocktail, right? Now, if it's a case of, working with AI to plan your, seasonal menu, then I don't see why you wouldn't have that happen sooner rather than later for two reasons. One, I often say that the cocktails that the AI makes, even when they are the best thing they've done, it's probably at best about a 90% cocktail. It's 90% of the way to being on the menu, okay, in any spot you want. But it's that last 10% that the human bartender could, kind of come in, tweak that recipe slightly, sub this for that, or maybe it's, maybe the AI is only spec'd rye whiskey. Well, you can fine tune the perfect rye for that cocktail or the perfect X for it. So in that scenario, I would think it makes sense, and we would see that sooner rather than later. I think that if it's a case of being able to kind of walk up and punch a cocktail in and AI go, let's do this, and then you've got to pour that, at that point, I don't know many bartenders who would want to do that.
So right now, in our clunky 90s cell phone era of AI, LLMs are incredibly powerful when it comes to generating original drinks that are about 90% of the way to being on the menu at any respectable cocktail bar. And not only that, but ChatGPT has thus far shown some pretty darn human instincts, at least when it comes to selecting the base spirits for its original creations.
So I think one of the things that I started to pick up on in season 1 was the number of times, without any specific guiding, that the human bartender and AI both went for the same base with the same modifiers, with the same profiles. And it shocked me because why did that human bartender go for that? I could almost understand why an AI would. It's got a set of data that it draws from. So maybe, some interrelational knowledge, said, oh, for this we want bourbon because, of X, Y, and Z, kind of trailing the chain backwards. But why the bartender? And we see that so often that we feed one prompt to both and we get the same base. And we're like, That's weird. In a world where you can use anything, why are you both using the same thing? I think that's something that I haven't even brought up to like my guests because I don't want to put it inside their head and them go, well, okay, I would normally go for bourbon, but now I'm going to go for, all right, aquavit it is, like.
When we're dealing with a technology that has a pattern recognition superpower, and we just so happen to notice a really obvious pattern of AI and human bartenders reliably choosing the same base spirits for their cocktails, I think this should make us sit up and pay attention, but maybe not for the reasons you'd suspect. Most people would understandably interpret this as meaning that AI is just creepy smart and good at cocktails. But I think what it actually reveals is how deceptively simple it is to create a drink that glides through life with a C average, and how comparatively difficult it is to engineer a truly creative and delicious cocktail that blows people away as an A+. It's not that AI is super talented, it's that the bar for making a decent drink is lower than most people realize, and the bar for incredible cocktails is higher than you'd suspect. Algorithms don't really have the luxury of thinking in shades of gray like a human can, which means they tend to exploit their data sets in order to fulfill expectations rather than exceed them. So if I'm an AI and I have thousands of old-fashioned recipes in my training data, and someone asks for an old-fashioned, I'm absolutely going to make that drink using whiskey unless there's something really explicit in the prompt that strongly indicates that a different base spirit, like rum, for example, is going to help me fulfill the requirements better. And this makes sense, right? If you walk into any bar and ask for an old-fashioned, 95% of the time, that bartender is at least going to start moving toward the rail whiskey bottle before they think to ask you any follow-up questions. This impulse perfectly mirrors the AI's binary logic tendency to fulfill rather than exceed the prompt. But it doesn't give us any further insight into how AI might unlock the ability to move beyond predictable flavor combos and relatively obvious riffs on classics. I think, to me, surprise is a big part of any aesthetic experience, including cocktails and flavor. And it seems like, in addition to the fact that there's no ability on the AI's part to actually try its own creation, I think that surprise might also be one of those areas, because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not in the AI's best interest to surprise you, because then it's almost kind of going against what you asked it to do. It's almost like disobeying the prompt. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Well, I don't know that the AI necessarily has a concept of surprising me or not. It's surprised me a few times with its ingredient selection. Like, there are moments where I've been like, really? Like you said, the one that sticks out is there was an episode, the Mr. Rogers episode, where it spec Lapsang Souchong tea infused simple syrup, which, like, I've got a pretty decent back bar and a pretty decently stocked pantry, and I was like, where do I find this? Like, I have no idea. And I actually called around to a couple of local places, and they're like, yeah, we don't stock that. And so, there are moments where it does surprise me. I think what it doesn't surprise with is pairing X and Y ingredients sometimes. I think it does a pretty straight ahead approach sometimes of that. If it's going to do bourbon, I can almost guess what it's going to throw in out of a pool of ingredients, right? It's not going to come out with something just completely left field. But, a lot of bartenders don't do that either. I think ultimately what it comes down to is the AI itself has no understanding of surprising me, but I think that it does operate under a set of logic that, at least to date, resets every time you use it, so it doesn't really learn as it's doing things. Now, I don't know how up to date you are with ChatGPT, but one of the things now is that they've enabled a memory functionality so that every conversation builds on previous conversations. And of course, you can opt for certain ones to not be included. That'll be interesting to see how season 2 shapes up, if it builds on the conversations that we have about cocktails, as we go through.
If you squint a little, doesn't that kind of make LLMs seem like apprentice bartenders who are on their way up and still learning the ropes? Right? They've read their little Death & Co. book and they know what a dry shake is, and now they think they're ready to take on the world. But in most cases, their new cocktail ideas are pretty unoriginal and their drink specs need a little bit of TLC from more experienced palates before they're menu ready. I wanted to see what Rob had to say about this. Yeah, multisensory is fascinating. I think that's somewhere that a lot of early bartenders kind of get caught up. They get caught up in Cocktail Codex. They get caught up in Mr. Potato Head. They get caught up in, okay, as long as I have 2 ounces of liquor and a half ounce of something as sweet as a simple syrup and then a couple dashes of something aromatic and bitter, then I've got an old fashioned. And they can take that to a logical extreme where I think the multisensory and the ground up of like, what happens if I combine molasses with, X, Y, or Z? And let's just do this and see. It's more of that inductive approach. So I think it's interesting how that plays out in both the ChatGPT world, the large language model world, and the bartending world. So because I think the temptation is when people look at your show, they're taking 2 competitors, an AI competitor and a human competitor, who seem to have vastly different skill sets and capabilities. And I think what's coming out more and more as you and I have this conversation is that actually it seems like the AI and certain bartenders might kind of share some of the same pitfalls and fatal assumptions when it comes to crafting that perfect cocktail.
Yeah, it's interesting to see, like you said, and it goes back to my humorous observation that, well, why do you pick that as your base? Why do you default to that? I see a lot of similarities, not so much with my guests, but with early bartenders, and seeing like, well, how much can I pack in this cocktail? Yeah, do I even consider bottle touches in this? Could I make this on a volume night? And that's one thing I will tell you. AI has no cares. It's like, this is like 8 bottle touches, and you've got to make like 3 different things on a burner before you can have this. So that's also kind of been one of those things, because for season 1 especially, we had a really quick turnaround for like, episode production oftentimes. And so I would get something from AI that was like, okay, so this has to sit for 3 days, and you're like, oh God. But I had a couple of episodes where I got something like that from a contestant.
Weirdly enough, AI and beginner bartenders are both guilty of some of the same flaws. And in the case of AI, this flaw has come to be known as overfitting. Here's a definition of that term from Microsoft. Quote, in machine learning, overfitting occurs when an algorithm fits too closely or even exactly to its training data, resulting in a model that can't make accurate predictions or conclusions from any data other than the training data. End quote. An example of overfitting in the bar world would be like when a relatively young cocktail bartender leaves their job at a high-end, kind of fussy cocktail joint and moves to more of a high-volume establishment. Chances are, without proper training, that bartender is going to frustrate their guests and the rest of the team by taking way too long and incorporating too many bells and whistles into their drink builds. In this case, a manager would need to inject a new set of training data into this bartender's repertoire, and we can assume that in the future, this bartender will probably do a much better job discriminating about when it's better to be fussy with their cocktails and when it's more appropriate to turn and burn so that the guests aren't stuck waiting. As you might expect, the reverse issue, underfitting, is also a liability with large language models. What's cool about ChatGPT is how much sheer data it has access to. On one hand, this is great for high consensus items like asking, what are the basic steps of a standard oil change? Even though there's a little bit of variation between cars, the basic parts and steps are all pretty much the same, and people who write about vehicles online all know those basic steps. It's like the first thing you learn in mechanic school. But the thing about food and cocktail recipes is that everybody's an amateur blogger with strong opinions. And there are some truly bizarre recipes out there. I shit you not, somebody last week emailed me a recipe for a smoked old-fashioned using dry ice to make the smoke effect. First of all, that's not smoke. And second of all, even though it's not technically dangerous to consume once the dry ice completely sublimates, it's a huge liability until then and shouldn't be written about casually on the internet without a ton of safety disclaimers. And there were no safety disclaimers on this blog post, I'll tell you that much. So while nobody out there is telling you to include antifreeze in your oil changes, I promise you there are a bunch of kooky cocktail and food recipes that are absolutely mucking up the data that ChatGPT was trained on. Think of it this way. You got two kids. You sit each one in front of the TV for a whole day. One kid has access to every TV channel in the world, and the other has a carefully curated set of educational options. When you get back home at the end of the day and you ask each one what they watched, the one with the educational programming might say, "Oh, yeah, I watched a documentary about tigers." And then the one who had access to an unfiltered TV feed might respond, "Me too, it was called Tiger King." You can see how crawling the entire internet indiscriminately for cocktail recipes might lead to some occasionally goofy outputs from ChatGPT. But while underfitting might be a problem for AI, I can't think of a situation where a larger data set is worse for an experienced human bartender. In other words, humans don't seem to glitch out when presented with a lot of data over time. In fact, it's precisely the opposite. Having more training in different cocktail techniques and bar settings tends to only produce better, more sophisticated bartenders. This brings us to what I think is the most important difference between human and AI mixologists. Human bartenders have bodies and brains, while ChatGPT is currently a very limited brain in a very expensive vat. What I mean by that is that the human brain has been estimated to be capable of roughly 1 exaflop. That's 1 billion calculations, or 10 to the 18th per second. It does this using only around 20 watts of power. Compare this to the supercomputers that run ChatGPT, which require thousands of watts per second to operate and can only support calculations in the teraflop range, which is 10 to the 12th. And these calculations are spread out across every computer running ChatGPT at a given moment. So the human brain outcompetes AI by orders of magnitude in terms of both efficiency and sheer computing power. And when it comes to cocktails, it has the third distinct advantage of direct data feeds from our sensory organs, which are themselves products of millions of years of refinement and evolution. This is why I totally agree that it's nifty that we've allowed ChatGPT to crawl a bunch of cocktail recipes and it can now spit out a pretty passable riff on a classic. But I think we're a far cry from seeing human bartenders actively replaced by robots. Because remember, even though the AI beat out 70% of bartenders in a live demo, those bartenders in the real world have the opportunity to test and dial in their flavor profiles, which means they can improve on their original drink builds and even the ones that are created by robot bartenders. Plus, we've mostly been looking at all this from the industry side of the bar. So I devised another little thought experiment to see how Rob thinks things would shake out if a real live bar guest found out their cocktail was designed by artificial intelligence. As a thought experiment that I've run in my own head, right, I imagine two scenarios, right? I imagine a scenario where I go to a cocktail bar and they tell me it's a new cocktail menu, right? So you have a cocktail in scenario A. You sit down and, you drink it and you're like, hot damn, this is the best cocktail I've ever had. Now, here's where the two scenarios diverge. In one scenario, the bartender who just made that cocktail for me is just like, oh yeah, I came up with this cocktail and they tell me the story of how they developed it, yada, yada, yada. And I'm like, oh man, that makes it taste even better. And then in another scenario, that bartender says, yeah, we had AI generate this menu. And I'm like, now I'm getting this weird aftertaste, right? Like there's something innate in me that almost makes me feel that if AI does it, it's not as good as if a person does it. I mean, have you ever had that kind of dissonance, and or do you have a possible solution? Because I imagine that if people like you just described do use this to create their menus, they're either going to have it as a shtick and they're gonna plaster it all everywhere, and everybody who comes through that door is going to know that AI made these drinks, or on the other hand, they're going to try and keep it secret, like a sin or something like that. So is there a way to maybe bring us closer to the center here? I don't know.
I really don't know if there's a good answer to this. Taste is not just on the tongue. It's that central processing unit up there, weighs heavily. And I think you made a good point that the moment where you know that this wasn't lovingly crafted, that it was just a product that was put out, it probably does alter your interpretation of it. Now, does it actually taste any different? No. I mean, the components don't shift, based on what but much in the way that there's debate over how good are sommeliers anyway, how much of your enjoyment is really in the glass versus in your head. Greg Ewan, who was a guest for the Star Wars episode, he has this thing that he talks about that it doesn't matter if someone shipped the bottle of limoncello that you had overlooking the Italian countryside that you thought was the best limoncello you'd ever had in your life. If they took that same bottle that you had a glass of and shipped it back to you at home and you poured it, it will never be as good as it was in that moment where you decided this is the best limoncello I've ever had in my life. Because it's not just what's in the glass, it's the entirety of the moment.
There's a couple of moments in this episode that I hope you can really key in on. One is that point I made earlier about decent cocktails being easy and incredible cocktails being extremely difficult. That explains a lot about why we're seeing the results that Rob has described from Drinking with Robots. But the other thing I'd be delighted if you took home from this episode to chew on and to ponder a little bit more from your own point of view is that flavor is not merely subjective. It's intersubjective. Having heard Rob's retelling of the limoncello fable, the obvious takeaway is that flavor happens in the brain, not just in the nose and mouth. That means we all have our unique experiences, and no two cocktails can ever truly be alike. In other words, flavor is subjective. But imagine a slightly different scenario. Let's say you were at a bar and you mentioned to your friend that you tried this incredible limoncello on your recent trip to Italy. The bartender overhears this, and they also notice that you're almost finished with your first round of drinks. As you go to place your order for the second, they say, "Hey, I heard you mention that you enjoyed some beautiful limoncello in Italy. I happen to have this wonderful Italian citrus liqueur called Italicus, which is made from a blend of Calabrian bergamots and Sicilian citrons. I'd be happy to pour you a sample, and if you like it, we have an original cocktail on our menu that features it, or I could mix up something special just for you." Then down comes that beautiful ocean blue bottle placed in front of you and your friend so that you can inspect and admire it while the bartender pours you each a taste. Maybe they throw in a little extra fact or a tasting note while you sample, and 9 times out of 10, you're going to walk out of this bar floating just slightly off the ground as a result of this wonderful flavor encounter and whatever cocktail came after it. So yes, flavor is subjective. But the story doesn't end there. Even though it might not be possible to ever truly replicate certain peak experiences, like the first time you tried chartreuse or the legendary martini service at Duke's Bar in London, what really talented bartenders are able to do is use their own stunningly sensitive pattern recognition systems to hook into and elaborate on those experiences so that the riff on a classic isn't just the liquid in your glass, but also the echoes in your memories and emotions. Amazing bartenders can do this because flavor tends to be more of a verb than it is a noun, a way of setting different bodies and minds in collective motion, despite those minds having completely different experiences, assumptions, and relationships with the drinks in front of them. Because flavor is more verb than it is noun, it's not just about the molecules that set off your taste buds and smell receptors, or even the ratios of ingredients in a cocktail recipe. It's about the mental ripples those building block materials set off inside every guest. In my opinion, this is why large language models tend to sputter out with cocktails that fall short of incredible. The AI can't taste, and the current versions that we're using have absolutely no way of experiencing emotions connected to flavor. In other words, AI bartenders can throw stones into the pond of consciousness using human-produced instruction manuals for stone throwing, but they currently have no way of perceiving the embodied, emotion-laden ripples that result. If you had asked me when I set out to record and assemble these AI episodes where I thought things would shake out, this is it. I figured we'd eventually conclude that AI is pretty good, but maybe not good enough to truly replace talented human bartenders. And following from this, we might conclude that AI in cocktails is just a fad that people are chasing, like the Keurig-style cocktail machines that people have been trying to push for a half a decade now, but which have never really taken off. And why is that, by the way? Well, because they produce drinks that are poor approximations of what they claim to be, and they're made to solve a problem that doesn't exist. Not unlike, one might argue, an AI bartender. But is there anything we could use AI for besides writing the rough drafts of our seasonal menus? I would argue that even though AI pattern recognition lacks any real consciousness or sensory integration, its ability to analyze so many different kinds of massive data sets might just allow it to identify patterns that humans can't perceive. One of the other components of AI that I think makes it a really interesting technology is the way in which the ability of the AI to access all of this data kind of does and also does not mirror what's going on in the human brain when you're trying to recall a memory or be creative or create a logical set of flavor affinities. And AI is just so powerful in the sheer amount and speed of like recall, you might call it, with the data sets it has available, that it seems like there would be some opportunities in there for the AI to come up with actual flavor pairings that we might not think would be amazing, but that turn out to be amazing. I don't know if you're familiar with the early 2000s Heston Blumenthal, Fat Duck in the UK. His big contribution at the time to, I guess, the culinary landscape was the white chocolate and caviar pairing. Two things that don't seem like they have anything to do with one another, and yet, for whatever reason, Heston Blumenthal used his unique culinary genius to put these things together, and then once he realized they tasted amazing together, then he went back into the chemistry and the biology and was like, oh, okay, well, here's why these things taste good together. And so it seems to me that in a world where the AI has such a huge data set, do you think it's possible that the AI is capable of pulling out these new flavor pairings that are actually novel, as opposed to just kind of using the existing data to kind of spin us out a riff on a classic, so to speak?
Yeah, I believe so. I think as a conceptual conversation, yes, I would totally believe that it could do that. Part of it is looking at what data sets it's trained on, that not knowing how much either you or the audience may know about it. All large language models, which is what ChatGPT is, are trained on data sets. And there's ways in which that training occurs that you kind of build the interrelational knowledge, right, that it can then draw from. But you can specify, you can basically train it further. For example, you can refine its knowledge by feeding it more of the data you want it to draw from. And so in that situation, I've actually been working just kind of my limited spare time of spinning up a local AI here kind of in my home lab and training it with additional data to see what it would do. So I think at the conceptual level, yes, I think AI is fully able to bring us that Parmesan cheese and espresso martini moment.
That's a fascinating example. I love that. I love that you called that out because that's exactly in the line of what I was thinking about. White chocolate and caviar, Parmesan cheese on an espresso martini. If these are some of the wacky flavor pairings that humans have come up with, I'm personally kind of excited to see what AI might be able to discover given some massive funky data sets pertaining to human flavor experience. Remember, the AI we've been talking about here has been large language models, things built to study and reproduce human speech and written knowledge. But you can design a custom machine learning algorithm to analyze really any kind of data set. Scientists have already used AI to successfully develop new antibiotics that can address certain antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So why wouldn't we be able to harness its power to sniff out untested flavor combos that have been lurking untested in the shadowy corners of the mind? But that's not all. Before Rob and I signed off, I came up with one more little suggestion that I thought could take a program like Drinking with Robots to the next level. I think it would be nice if the AI learned to talk a little bit of shit.
I've ran stuff through AI and had it create its own persona. And if there were about 5 more hours in a day, I would love to actually feed some of these personas into some of the other AIs that exist for, speech generation, for example, and have a competitor actually come on and actually literally talk some shit. I mean, how amazing would that be, to have almost like a banter back and forth with the AI? Because right now, when I bring the human bartender in for the interview portion, we talk about the AI's cocktail, and the human bartender kind of gets to have input on the spec that AI is generated, and sometimes the input is, oh God, I did not bring my strong enough game for this, and sometimes it's like, are you serious? It did that. So giving the AI a chance for a rebuttal would actually be kind of hilarious.
In the end, I'm pretty happy with the questions that this AI cocktails topic has forced me to consider so far. What am I willing to outsource to artificial intelligence? How is the intersubjectivity of flavor actually a human superpower? And how can we use LLMs and other AI programs as tools that enhance what human bartenders are already really good at? You may choose, like me, to conclude that at least for a while, AI should be considered, at best, an apprentice mixologist, and that, like any apprentice, it should be assigned primarily to time-consuming but basic tasks. Or perhaps you're more of an optimist. Maybe you know or see or suspect something about AI that I don't. A spark of potential that could have it replacing human bartenders in the next few years. Either way, I'm so grateful that you joined me for this Cocktail Futurism episode. It was a lot of work to put together, so I hope it doesn't come off as entirely incoherent. I'm excited to bring you more great interview and audio essay content as we forge our way ahead into this brave new world that is 2025. And as always, I implore you to drink responsibly and experiment boldly. Cheers. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, there's a couple things you can do to help the show. One would be to rate and review this program anywhere you enjoy listening to podcasts, especially on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. The more ratings and reviews we have, the easier it will be for other like-minded flavor nerds to enjoy the content that I produce. You can also follow the Modern Bar Cart YouTube channel, where I post video clips from the podcast and beyond. And you can join our growing Discord community, which is where our listeners submit questions for upcoming guests and chat about all kinds of fun spirits and cocktail shenanigans. It's also where I share fun perks and discounts that are too exclusive to blast out on the airwaves. To join our community Discord server or get in touch with me for any other reason, all you need to do is drop me a line by emailing podcast@modernbarcart.com. This episode may be over, but for you, the mixological fun and boozy adventures are just beginning. So remember, drink responsibly and experiment boldly. This episode was made possible with editing and sound design by Samantha Reed, AI and cocktail insights courtesy of Rob Nestor, creator of the hit podcast Drinking with Robots, and a little bit of intersubjective flavor magic by yours truly. This has been a Direct Fire Studios production, copyright 2000 and, wait for it, 25.